Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending our panel. My name is Bob Nardini. I'm Vice President for Library Services at ProQuest Books. And I'm happy to be the moderator for 4 panelists who represent different types of academic libraries and who today at Virtual Charleston will talk about why they think some of the change that all of us have experienced this year will be permanent change. We have only 30 minutes, so at the end of our session, if there's time left, we'll have a little Q&A. But otherwise, I'll follow the chat as we progress. But otherwise, we'll get things going. The panelists will introduce themselves as they talk, starting with Bill Maldarich of New York University. So Bill, you are on.
Thanks, Bob. Hi, I'm Bill Maldarich. I'm the head of collection development at New York University Libraries. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the places during this pandemic where we noticed definitions or things that we thought of together falling apart a little bit, and changes we made because of that I think will stick. And so I will say that because NYU has global campuses, we have a campus in Abu Dhabi, we have a campus in Shanghai. We had really pretty robust electronic resources collections, so that books, journals, databases, so that when people started working remotely, when people started researching and learning remotely, we had a little bit of a head start as far as electronic resource access. But at the same time, I think pretty immediately, we started to notice all this division between what we owned and what we could share, either with NYU community or with other people. That was true of print and of E. So we had, to me, it was really interesting that all the books that were in the stacks on site at our library were locked in the library. We didn't have people there who could get to them. So at the same time, the books that we had in offsite storage, we could get a handle on. So we started to think a little bit about this relationship between what do we have and what could we share. And for ebooks at the same time, we could share them locally, but questions about as ILL shut down with people working remotely, we can't share most of our ebooks, questions about ebook interlibrary loan rights. And that brings me to the idea of this connection between another division that kind of got fuzzy between print and electronic access. So what really brought that to the front was the HATI ETAS, the Emergency Temporary Act. I'm sorry, I'm going to forget it, but ETAS, I'm certain you're familiar. But the matching of our print holdings with electronic access on the HATI Trust site, that was a real boon for us and for lots of libraries, I'm certain. And it brought out this the importance of the connection between print ownership and access possibilities. So I think in that context, we started to really think about ownership, sharing, what we could borrow, what we could lend, differences in format and connections between formats. Also what came out was what can we and can't we buy? And I think that was really apparent with our faculty and with course materials, with textbooks. There were a lot of times where people wanted things that we had to tell people, well, that's not for sale to academic libraries in a way that we can offer them. And one of the things that I think is a bonus about that, I hope was true about that, was that meant that not only were we thinking about sharing and what we had and how people could get to content, but that maybe professors or instructors were thinking about the relationship between assignments and what people can get easily and affordably. That would be a wonderful thing. But so pursuing this kind of gap between ownership and access, or this conflation a little bit of print and E, we started thinking about the ability to loan ebooks through interlibrary loan. We started to think about controlled digital lending, sort of that association between print holdings and the ability to share access electronically. In both of those pieces, you wonder about rights, you wonder about costs, and you wonder about the technological infrastructure that makes doing those things possible. particularly when we thought about the technology piece, there was another sort of set of things going on around Library Simplified and Simply E, an infrastructure for serving up electronic books, super popular among the public libraries, and our peers at Columbia University, I think we're among the first to start looking at Simply E and academic libraries. And so we were looking at the idea of the open standards that allows Library Simplified to run, and think about how does that infrastructure, an open standard infrastructure work, could it help us to think through not only the kinds of problems about platform and standards of delivery and being able to read an ebook on a phone, but also to think about could that help with ILL? Could that help with controlled digital lending? So questions of infrastructure. And so I think what has been very encouraging about asking these questions has been the fact that there's been a lot of movement since March in all these areas. There are the things that I'm very familiar with, and in each of these areas, I know there's lots of libraries and other partners working as well. So if I think about Library Simplified, the Simply E infrastructure, like I said, Columbia and Rob Cardilano there have been doing a lot of work. At the same time, so we're involved with Lyrasis and with ProQuest in a pilot project to try to look at delivering ebooks. We have a lot of ebooks on one platform because we dual host our ebooks, and so trying to look at how do we do the mechanism for delivering those ebooks through Simply E. For ebook ILL, I know that there's homegrown technical solutions at a lot of libraries. A lot of people have been working on how can we manage, lots of creativity around sort of making those kinds of ILL loans. We have a pilot project going on, again with ProQuest, with a number of cohorts of libraries, some East Coast libraries, some West Coast libraries, Colorado libraries, working on whole ebook ILL. And then controlled digital lending. I mean, it's been topic of conversation all over the place here for good reason. Lots of people seeing the importance of that. If you think of like the CDLI group, there's tons of work going on around that. And so I think there's this chance for thinking about infrastructure, thinking about sharing, thinking about working together that has come clear, partially egged on by the pandemic. And I think that sort of way of thinking is a win, and it's something I certainly hope is going to stick with us. I think it also opens a lot of questions about what does the ebook market look like going forward? What are our, what do we look for going forward? But it's certainly encouraging developments, and I think certainly an exciting time. So I wanted to bring that up. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. Let me put the slides back up for.
Thank you, Bob. My name is John Lassiter. I am the Director of Library Services for Georgia Northwestern Technical College in Rome, Georgia. We are a two-year institution with 6 campuses in the northwest part of the state, roughly between Chattanooga and Atlanta. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is why academic libraries will never be the same from a 2-year and a community college perspective. Next slide, if you would, Bob.
Slide is not advancing. It takes a while for it to cast. Keep hitting it. Start talking and the slide will catch up with you, I think, John.
Okay. So what I want to, let me see if I can. I don't have a printout of my slide in front of me. Just a moment. All right, there we go. Some of the key characteristics of my institution that will govern my perspective and my response as a library director to COVID-19. As I said, we're a two-year community college institution, and we're not a research institution, and we're non-residential. So we're very different from many of you. And not being a research institution and being non-residential, that really changes the character and the nature of our students. Many of our students transferred to local four-year institutions. We're kind of known as having a good deal for general education courses. Per credit hour, we're far less expensive, so students take advantage of those discounts and then transfer on to four-year and research institutions. Just so you can get an idea of our size, fall FTE 3015, roughly down 4% from fall of last year. We were trending upwards, but that 4% was kind of significant for us. Pre-COVID, our enrollment was 40% online. So we were very much in the process of transitioning to a mostly distance learning environment. So the questions I want to ask basically center on what does the change that I see moving forward, what does it basically look like? How will things look different? The first thing that came to mind when assessing this is realizing that often temporary measures and effects may and often do become permanent. So all of us, I'm sure, can attest to how budget cuts and furloughs are affecting us. In my case, I initially thought that I was going to have to deal with a 14 or even a 17% budget cut, but ultimately it was a 10% budget cut. 10% was significant. It also affected basically my part-time staff. I've had to let one part-time staff member go, and that has drastically reduced our operating hours because many two-year and community college institutions operate on very lean staffing models. So the furloughs affected operating hours. The reduced hours and budget has affected reduced physical item usage. All of our general education courses are online. We do have some lab-based courses that can only be completed on campus. We historically have not seen many of those students, so that has contributed to reduced facility usage. So it's kind of a domino effect in many ways, and hopefully those changes will not be permanent. So what are some other ways that things will be different? Well, I'm seeing an increased need for relevancy. And basically, I've looked at this in three different areas. I need to have a more direct involvement in teaching and learning. So I'm very much transitioning collection development policies towards materials that directly support teaching and learning. We have a stronger presence in our our learning management system. Through new integrations, we use Blackboard. So, for example, the first part of this year, I integrated Leganto into Blackboard, and so that is directly helping faculty and students with reading lists. Also, finding a seat at the table that addresses the textbook issue. In our case, we have a very strong OER presence. All of our general education courses use open educational resources for those texts. And for about the past year and a half, we had a very, very strong push for that. That has paid off. And so even pre-COVID, I wanted to make sure that I was part of the solution and not part of the problem in terms of textbooks. New challenges. Initially, I was optimistic when this started. And I have made a decision to remain optimistic. It's a daily decision. Sometimes when your budget or your usage is not what you want it to be, you definitely have to make that decision. Innovating on a smaller budget is very much a challenge. You know, what do you cut so that you can innovate in another area? Typically what I'm seeing is that I'm having to cut budgets for physical items so that I have more budget in other areas. So far that hasn't been an issue. Virtual faculty engagement. Typically, our faculty are in their offices. Again, we have come back to our campuses, but faculty have very much a mixed presence, which means either way that we have to try to engage them virtually. Our model previously was basically face-to-face engagement. The virtual engagement is very much a challenge. Basically, if I had to sum everything up, COVID-19 accelerated changes already in process. Fortunately, we were already on the road to being more embedded within our LMS, and we're shifting towards electronic resources very, very heavily, but it has accelerated the pace of change. So thank you for attending today.
Kim, apologies. Let me find your slides.
I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Kim Armstrong. I'm the Executive Director of the Orbis Cascade Alliance. And Bob has slides for me, I think. So I'll just say that my presentation is not based on a single consortial experience, such as my consortium at the Orbis Cascade. It really is directly thank you to the ICULT community, the International Coalition of Library Consortia, all of whom have engaged in a very robust listserv conversation since March. We had a virtual conference in July, and then a number of them volunteered to do one-on-one interviews with me in preparation for this presentation. And what I found was I'm not presenting this by consortium. There really were themes that emerged that were very common to all of us, even though all academic library consortia function a little bit differently. Each one has a little bit different remit, but it will amplify, and you'll hear a number of the same themes that John and Bill were talking about in the beginning of this, and I think Grace Mary will follow up with. I didn't prescribe these interviews. I didn't have a script for the folks. I asked them to talk to me about the short-term impact of COVID, which would have been, let's say, March to August, or pre-instructional time starting in the fall. And then what did they see longer term, that the ways that their consortia were going to have to adapt or pivot to meet emerging needs or new priorities from their membership. So in the short term, I'd say, interestingly, every one of the consortial heads said they made much more space for informal engagement with their membership. And that doesn't sound all that wildly creative or interesting, but consortia are mindful of the time that they're asking of their membership, of their librarians who are participating. And so we have pretty structured and tight calendars, but it turns out as people were shutting down libraries, sending staff home, people were pivoting to doing so much electronic support, they needed a space where they could get together, where they could swap information quickly, where they could hear about strategies and just connect with folks who were doing the same thing. And so I, over and over amongst a dozen interviews, I heard, we pretty much stopped these formal meetings, or the formal meetings stayed in place, but we created a water cooler, a virtual water cooler. We created Birds of a Feather, and they were incredibly popular. Some were thematic, others were just whoever could show up could come and talk. And a couple of other themes Bob, if you'll go to the next slide, were touched on by the others. So in the interest of time, I won't touch on those. But what I will say is absolutely on the demand for electronic content to support instruction for us and for other consortia, streaming media, which I don't think have been mentioned yet, became a very, very high priority. So a lot of us were out looking for opportunities to license or acquire streaming media for our membership that would work. Consortia often hold those big multi-year licenses for their members, and to a person, they started renegotiating when publishers had not come out. And so, of course, some of the publisher partners had come out and said, we're going to hold 2022 flat. There's not going to be any inflation. That was great. It allowed for some planning, but in many, many cases, all of these consortia had to spend significant time going back and trying to renegotiate inflation on the multi-year licenses because of the concerns about the budget impacts for the next at least few years, significant budget impacts. Perhaps unique to consortia is that many of us have a historic and strong relationship to be the provider of print resource sharing. And in all of those cases, how did we stop that? How have we gradually been starting that back up since maybe August or so? Many of us have been following the realm study, the OCLC materials handling, and that's non-trivial operations for many of these consortia, and ultimately will have impact going forward. In terms of the long term, all of us are thinking about how we might freeze or reduce our membership fees. What can we do in our own operations to reduce our costs so that our members aren't bearing any additional undue burden by remaining in the consortium so that we don't lose membership? Controlled digital lending, I think the others already spoke about. Meta collaboration, I think increasingly consortia are looking to their peers for partnerships and opportunities where we can leverage programs and services at scale so that we don't have to devise them or support them individually. And I think we'll see more of those coming out of this time. And then really the evaluation with our member libraries of what are our long-term priorities, what's the same, and now what has changed I think everyone has already spoken, but I think it's absolutely right. Many of the issues were already under consideration. Many were already under development, but this time has really accelerated and clarified for us. How do we need to get out of a hybrid environment that is no longer serving, especially on the electronic side, all of our users and all of the demands? And if you go to the last slide, Bob, please. And I'll just close quickly by saying, for consortia, increased need to demonstrate what are we providing for the investment. Return on investment is going to be very important for us to speak to our members about. Equity of access is going to be, we didn't talk about DEI here in this context, but equity is now about who has access to what kind of information when there's not always access to print. And then finally, the new business models for e-content. I think we all realize how short libraries, content providers came up short in terms of being able to match a print equivalency. So thank you all.
Thanks, Kim. Let me get back to the original file, please, Grace Mary.
Okay. I think I'll just introduce myself while we're waiting. I'm Grace Mary Smolowitz, and I am the former head of collection services at Rutgers University. And I can start while you're pulling up slides, I think. So a quote from an article in the New Yorker: "Great crises tend to bring profound social change for good or ill." And I think we will talk about the good rather than the ill at this point. But bear with me, we're going to take a very quick historical tour. Lawrence Wright offered this article called How Pandemics Wreak Havoc and Open Minds. It was an introduction to an interview with Jana Pomata, a retired professor of the history of medicine at the Institute of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University. The interview was presented in the New Yorker, and Ms. Pomata compared the COVID pandemic to the bubonic plague. This article interested me as it highlighted what brought society out of the Middle Ages: where millions had died, and into the Renaissance. The rebirth was attributed to waves of creative thinking. Prior to the rebirth, the study of medicine was considered scholastic and not an empirical process. According to Boccaccio, the advice of doctors and the power of medicine appeared useless and unavailing. And this sounds familiar. The overthrow of this thinking occurred because doctors put aside scholastic medicine and used empirical evidence in their evaluations. According to Pomada, refreshing new intellectual perspectives in medicine, the arts, infrastructure, and design, as well as exploration and education came about. Pomada feels and is actually hoping that something similar for the economy and culture will take place today. I share Pomada's hope for these areas and especially for education. I think we can go to the next slide. I reflected on her perspective and looked at how all libraries, and Rutgers University in particular, reacted to the need for immediate change. Rutgers is a school of approximately 71,000 graduates and undergraduate students on 3 campuses with 2 medical schools. There are 23,600 faculty and staff. Although very large compared to most, we were faced with the same dilemmas that others smaller in size faced. Like most institutions, Rutgers immediately began work to provide what was essential for faculty, students, and staff to function in the new remote environment. Many web page announcements were created to guide the library community on how to navigate remotely, especially with all buildings being closed. Extensive LibGuides were created to help with the technical changes, how to use Zoom and WebEx, how to access course reserves and other access services information. From our medical librarians, guides were created about COVID, and many more guides and updates were offered. Pomada spoke about cultural changes, and I reflected on what we were doing that influenced the culture of the libraries at this time. Rutgers had had an immediate shutdown and everyone was thrown into remote work. Folks spoke of feeling isolated. The culture of online meetings was, for many, took some getting used to. The university librarian routinely posted information on the COVID virus and the effects on the university, and specifically the libraries. I was surprised to learn that shortly after the shutdown, the libraries were hosting a Zoom formatted full program on the state of the libraries, usually an annual in-person event that is extremely well attended. The program brought the library's staff and faculty together online as a community. It opened with slides of staff in their makeshift home offices, children, pets, and all. Announcements were made of the posters that would appear on YouTube. What could have been an uncomfortable remote environment evolved into the familiar. The human element and the work of the posters showed everyone that our traditions continued and important things were happening. The program highlighted implementations that made operations possible and also displayed posters of projects that would enhance website design, instruction, course reserves, and access in the future. All could look ahead to some exciting developments. All of this was informative and stabilizing for our library staff and faculty. Next slide. Yes. From discussion groups I participated in during COVID, one hosted by Bob Nardini, in which libraries from around the world participated, and 2 other programs hosted by regional and national consortia. I have heard similar concerns from each group, frequently repeated. The ability to provide online textbooks to students and how to perform digital lending and to supply digitized monographs for course reserves and research, and much more. Anecdotally, I've heard that this current period has the potential for tremendous developments, that there is a hunger for projects and new business. Libraries having very large budget restrictions are also looking for more creative and less restrictive business models and perhaps more partnerships that enable shared acquisitions, as others have mentioned, and or shared access. Okay, I'm just looking where we are. What will help to make these things happen? I think we can move to the next slide. We need to probe, control digital lending more deeply and encourage its use. The frustration of being unable to provide resources to faculty and students because of digitization constraints was a common thread among the discussion groups. Controlled digital lending, if protocols are followed appropriately, can alleviate much of that frustration. If strict rules are followed, it can increase the number of titles available. This protocol needs continued advocacy. What else can help? We should be able to encourage a more cost-effective method for providing online textbooks for students. Collectively, libraries and consortia should be able to influence that market and perhaps partner with publishers on new business models. An article in LJ, Library Journal, written by Matt Ennis, entitled, "How Vendors Are Working with Academic Libraries in Their Pivot to Digital," noted that the current pandemic would likely cause a rethinking of academic instruction, innovations in online learning, and a renewed appreciation for the resources provided by campus libraries. Excuse me. What else would help? The area that is gaining momentum and is becoming explosive in the research and discovery community is work with artificial intelligence. The ability to create expansive searches beyond the functionality of the current discovery tools is impressive. Some AI functionalities already exist in discovery tools, but continued developments make the possibilities much greater. Areas that are being highlighted. AI can disambiguate and understand references. AI is designed to create knowledge graphs, which form relationships based on context and concepts to assist in research and vast discovery, not just using keyword associations. AI uses semantic relationships to retrieve related information. And lastly, AI can provide predictive data. For example, measuring student success, measuring and analyzing collections. There is so much to explore and perhaps apply through AI that would benefit libraries and their related communities. It seems that some of this exploration and implementation is already taking place. Adaptation in this area alone would cultivate a much greater interest in resources the libraries provide. It also seems that there is a lot to hope for and to work for in this post-pandemic year. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace Mary, and thanks to all the panelists, and thanks especially to our audience for attending our panel for this past half hour. I wish we had a lot more time. We certainly could talk for more than 30 minutes. Thank you, everybody, and see you next session.
Thank you.